So I, like a lot of people, find missing persons cases to be really interesting. Something about somebody going missing or multiple people going missing and never being seen again is just eerie to me. It's creepy. A lot of people think that as well. But I think what is more interesting is when somebody shows back up but might not be who they said they were. So this is what we're going to talk about today. It's a case that happened in the Grand Canyon like 100 years ago. So if you don't know the Grand Canyon, it's in the US, it's in Arizona. It is massive. It is just like actually really big. A lot of people are like, yeah, of course the Grand Canyon's big, but seriously, it's enormous. I've been there before. It's really cool. But anyway, in 1928, Glenn and Bessie Hyde were a newlywed couple, and they decided to raft down the Colorado River, which flows through the Grand Canyon. And they were pretty good at what they did. They seemed like they had a lot of confidence, but it was like the 1920s, so I don't know. They could have had a lot of misplaced confidence. People did back then. But anyway, they went rafting down the river, and it seemed to go well. And then they went missing. So they were last seen on November 18th. They stopped at Grand Canyon Village, which is at the base of the Grand Canyon, and they got off their raft, and that was the last anybody saw of them. They found their boat later. Their boat was in pretty much pristine condition, but they couldn't find Glenn and Bessie. So it's a pretty typical story. The only thing that makes it more interesting is that the boat was found in pristine condition. Back then, typically if somebody went missing on the river, it's because they got caught up in rapids and their boat would have been destroyed. But anyway, Glenn and Bessie went missing. People were like, what is going on? I don't know where these people went. They were reported missing, but again, this was back in the 1920s, so like that stuff just wasn't how we know it today. Nobody was really looking for them, but they kind of became almost a legend in the Grand Canyon, kind of a cautionary tale of like, hey, you better be good at what you're doing or else you're going to end up like Glenn and Bessie Hyde. And it just became almost like a ghost story where people will make up theories about what happened to them. Did they just die in the rapids? Well, maybe not. Did they try to swim? Were they eaten by animals? Were they killed by some supernatural creature? All the stuff you would imagine. And it went on like that for years, up until a couple years after. So this is just like 7 or 8 years after. There was a group of people who were also traveling down through the Grand Canyon. Same thing, they were river rafting. At this point, the idea of traveling down the Grand Canyon was a lot more safe. So this was like probably 10 to 20 years later. There's not an exact date on this. But anyway, they were rafting down the river and they decided to camp for the night. And they ran into a woman named Georgie Clark. And Georgie Clark was like, hey, can I stay with you guys? I've just been hanging out in the Grand Canyon for a while, but can I hang out with you guys? And they were like, okay. So again, this must have been back in the day, because now if some creepy person was like, hey, can I come stay with you guys while you're river rafting? Everyone would be like, no, please get out of here. This is horrifying. But anyway, Georgie Clark, she heads down with them. She's actually a really good passenger with them. She like helps them. She knows the river really well. She knows just the wildlife of the area. She said she lived there for a long time. And they're like, cool. Well, this is awesome. But near the end of the trip, Georgie Clark, so again, this mysterious woman, they're all sitting around the campfire and they're telling ghost stories. And Georgie Clark's like, well, I have a ghost story of my own. And they're like, well, what is it? And she's like, have you guys ever heard of Glenn and Bessie Hyde? And they're like, yeah, we have heard of Glenn and Bessie. They're like, everybody knows about them. We assume they just died in the river. And Georgie Clark's like, that actually didn't happen because I'm Bessie Hyde. And everybody just kind of was weirded out by that. And they assumed that Georgie Clark was kind of crazy because they're like, here's this old woman who has been hanging out in the river for a long time and is claiming to be somebody that we're all pretty sure is dead. But anyway, Georgie Clark says that she is Bessie Hyde, and the group doesn't think much of it. They finish their trip, and Georgie Clark just heads off and does her own thing, and she goes back to living in a nearby town. And then a couple years after that, Georgie Clark dies. And again, nobody really said much. She really didn't tell people that she was Bessie Hyde. She had said that she had killed her husband and then just lived in the Grand Canyon for a long time, but it seemed like an unlikely story. But anyway, after Georgie Clark died, she lived in a small house, and they went through all the possessions of the house, and they discovered that she did own a gun that was said to be one that Glenn and Bessie Hyde were carrying on them at the time that they went missing, and that she also had a marriage certificate for Glenn and Bessie Hyde. So it kind of became this weird scenario of like, is Georgie Clark telling the truth? Did she essentially live in this nearby town, kill her husband? There had been lots of rumors that marriage wasn't very good. Again, it was like the 1920s, so it might have just been kind of like not an arranged marriage, but something that Bessie wasn't happy about, but couldn't really voice her opinion because women didn't have a total ton of rights back then. I'm glad things are different now. But anyway, Georgie Clark claimed she was Bessie Hyde, and she seemed to have the documents to back that up. I found this story really interesting, but it's not without its flaws. One is that Georgie Clark's early life was really well documented in that specific town. So people knew her growing up, and so if she was really Bessie Hyde, it wouldn't quite line up with where they both grew up. It seemed like she was most likely crazy or making this up, and maybe the marriage certificate she had on her was a forgery. The other thing that people have speculated is that Bessie Hyde was killed by Georgie Clark. This one, I don't want to like throw shade at Georgie Clark because I think she was probably just crazy, but it is just an interesting story. Again, the Grand Canyon is so interesting and mysterious to me, and so thinking about this woman who claims that she's somebody else and then actually has the evidence to back it up was just really interesting. But anyway, that's going to do it for today. This is kind of a different style of video than I normally make. I usually make long scripted content about music and kind of mysterious stuff. So if you're interested in that, please go watch that. Please subscribe to me, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.